Great. And hi, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Alumni Relations Officer at SAIS, and I'm here with Dick Murphy, who is an alumni of SAIS from the class of 1958. And it's so great to have you today, and we're just going to ask you a few questions and kind of have a conversation.
Okay.
So, thanks. And you can put that down if you want. It's whatever you're comfortable with. I guess the first question just is, what brought you to SAIS originally when you started?
Well, I'll try to keep it as brief as I can, but it is a bit of a long story.
It's all right.
I graduated from Yale in 1954, and I was a history major at Yale. And while I was at Yale, I became interested in Asia, largely through two courses. I took a course in political science on governments and politics in China and Japan, and the best course I took at Yale was a course in Chinese history. And but I was also in the Army ROTC, so I had a commitment to active duty with the Army. And I got into a special program while I was in ROTC, an intelligence program. And so when I graduated from Yale, instead of going into the field artillery, which is what I'd been trained in, I went into the Army's counterintelligence corps.
Mm-hmm.
As a second lieutenant. I was trained up in Baltimore, and then after an intensive 2-month course in spoken Japanese, I went to Japan first and then to Korea. This was back in 1955 and 56. So I got the area of the world that I wanted to go. And so that only heightened my interest not only in Asia, but in international affairs and the intelligence business. And I originally had intended to go to law school, but I changed my mind, and while I was in the service in Korea, I decided I wanted to go on for a master's degree in international relations.
And how long had it been since you had graduated from Yale?
Well, when I went over to Asia, it was a year after I graduated from Yale. I was there in 1955, and I was there from March of '55 until July of 1956.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of years, yeah.
Yeah. So while I was in Korea, I took the graduate record exam in an old schoolhouse in downtown Seoul, which was still devastated from the war. Mm-hmm. And I remember taking that in January of 1956 in an unheated room, and I did the graduate record exam there. And I was also applying to different graduate schools, one of which was not SAIS. I applied to several schools, and I was accepted at every one except the one I really wanted to go to. I was accepted at University of California, Berkeley, University of Washington in Seattle, George Washington University. I know those were 3. I must have been accepted at about 4 or 5 different graduate schools. And in Yale. Mm-hmm. I applied to Yale, although I didn't want to go back to Yale. I thought it'd be better to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. The school I really wanted to go to at Columbia University, the East Asian Institute, did not accept me, which really enraged my father, who was a graduate of Columbia College and Columbia Physicians and Surgeons. He was a pediatrician. And I, of course, was upset about that. So when I came back from Korea, got out of the Army in July of '56, the following month I went down to New Haven. And I went to see the Dean of the Yale Graduate School to have him make the pitch to me as to why I ought to go to Yale. Mm-hmm. And then I went to see my professor of Chinese history, Richard Walker, Dixie Walker. And I saw Dixie at his home in Orange, Connecticut, and I said, Dixie, I said, I don't want to go to Yale. And he said, no, you don't want to go to Yale. and he said, "Have you ever heard of the School of Advanced International Studies?" I said, "No, I don't think so." And he said, "Have you ever heard of Paul Linebarger?" I said, "Oh yeah." I said, "We read some stuff by him in your course, as I recall, and maybe in David Rowe's course as well." And he said, "Paul is a professor at the school." He said, "It's a part of Johns Hopkins." And he said, "It's an excellent school." He said, "If you're interested," he said, "I'd be glad to get in touch with Paul and have him interview you." So I said, "Sure." So sometime that month, probably in the first half of August, I drove from Elmira, New York, my hometown, down to Washington on a Friday. I spent the night in Bethesda, and I drove down to SAIS on Florida Avenue, and we met in Paul's office. And Paul was probably the most brilliant man I've ever known. He was quite a character too, but he was the closest thing to a genius. And but anyway, Paul was not a modest fellow. I'd say the first part of the interview was about Paul Linebarger, and then we got around to talking about the school. And he told me about, basically what the different courses were, and the requirements for the degree and all of that. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, yes, I'd be interested." He said, "Fill out this form," and he said, "Take it home with you and fill it out, the admissions form."
Right.
And he said, "Mail it to Elma Louise Baker, she's our registrar, with a check." He said, "I don't think you'll have any problem." And I was accepted.
Wow, congratulations.
Things were a little easier in those days.
That is a really interesting
And
story.
so
Yeah.
that's how I got to SAIS.
That's great. And tell me a little bit about your memories while you were at SAIS. What do you cherish? What do you remember from being there?
Well, I think one of the things, of course, were the different professors and the dean. It was a small school. I doubt if we had more than 100 students. I think it was more like between 75 and 100 students.
And Bologna had started a couple of years before
55.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we were, it was really an intimate thing. We had two buildings, one on Florida Avenue, which was a brick building which originally had been a day school for girls. It was not Holton Arms, because Holton Arms was across Connecticut Avenue on S Street. Now it's out in Bethesda. But when SAIS began, that's the building they bought. And it was a 4-story building, brick building, facing what is now the Washington Hilton Hotel. Back then it was a field and a hill. Then around the corner on 18th Street was, 19th Street, because it was 1906 Florida Avenue. There was another building right around the corner. That building housed the offices of the, I think it was called the Foreign Service Educational Foundation, which was Paul Nitze. Paul hung his hat there. And there was a large, I say large, wasn't all that big, but there was a lecture room there. Every Saturday morning I'd have my European diplomacy class in that lecture room.
That's great.
From 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock. And Dr. William Franklin, who was the historian of the Department of State, he lectured to us every Saturday in a course that was European diplomacy from 1815 to 1914. And Franklin put great stock on us remembering everything he said in his lectures. And he spoke very rapidly, and I was writing like this furiously. And when we finished, I'd go back to my room. And let me just sidestep a bit.
Sure.
That building on Florida Avenue, the top 2 stories were dormitory rooms for the men. The women had to live on the local economy, but we had just a handful of women there. But living in that dormitory, that was part of our tuition and fee to go to SAIS. I was up on the 4th floor, and I had a single room up there. I think they were all single rooms. And our house mother was Mr. Shork. He was the librarian. The librarian was down on the 2nd floor, and it had been a gymnasium when it was a girls' school. So it was the library. And Mr. Shork was, he was a bit of an oddball, very good librarian, but a bit of a character. And I used to complain to Shork about my quarters. I said, I had better quarters in Korea. I said, the Quonset hut that I lived in there, the Imperial Suite, that was a high-class joint compared to this dump here, you know? And he took me seriously, you know? I don't think he liked me. But anyway, back to Mr. Franklin. As soon as I'd finished that class at 1 o'clock, you know, I wouldn't go to lunch. I'd go back to my room, sit down at the typewriter, and type up my notes. I typed up all of my notes while I was at SAIS. Thank God I had learned how to type before I went to Yale. It's just too bad I didn't learn shorthand at the same time. But anyway, you know, by the time I finished typing my notes, you know, it was probably around 2:30, you know, so I was hungry. You know, so I'd go to a restaurant nearby.
Yeah, get yourself some lunch.
Yeah, but Franklin was, you know, but Paul Linebarger, who was my principal professor there, because East Asia was my regional area of concentration. Sure. Paul was, he was just brilliant and a character, and he could tell some of the raunchiest stories imaginable. I wasn't in his, I took you know, different courses on China from him, and Japan, and but he was quite a character. He talked a lot about himself, but I mean, he really, you know, he knew China very well. His father had been a judge, a federal judge in the Philippines, and he was also a legal advisor to Sun Yat-sen. And Paul Linebarger, as a child, remembered Sun Yat-sen.
Wow. And
he served in China during the World War II. He was an officer with Army psychological warfare. And so when he was at SAIS, besides teaching courses on China and Japan, he also taught a course in international information policies, because this was at the time the USIA had been set up. And in one of his classes, and that must have been another year, but I heard about it, he had, there was one woman in there, she was a Marine captain, and Linebarger would tell these stories, and depending on how raunchy they were, he would promote her. He'd say, well, he'd said, this one for you, he said, you're a colonel. You know, but he was, and he had one eye, he had an artificial eye, and he also, the ties that he wore were solid colored ties with this funny looking writing on it. And you'd ask him, well, what is that? And he said, these are ancient Chinese characters. And what does it say? Paul Linebarger.
He labeled his own ties.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's great.
So, yeah, he'd either wear a solid colored tie with those characters on, or another solid colored tie with the emblem of the China-Burma-India Theater from World War II.
That sounds like a
But,
great relationship
yeah.
you had with him.
But yes, and,
Yeah.
he and his wife would have us out to their house for dinner, and he also took us to the Peking restaurant out in Connecticut Avenue near Chevy Chase Circle, where he would where we'd have a dinner Peking duck.
Oh, that's great.
But in his house, in addition to being a professor at SAIS, Paul was also a science fiction writer under the pseudonym of Cordwainer Smith. And he had his books on his shelf in various languages. And I remember being out at his house one time when just that day he had received in the mail a translation of his book, one of his books in Farsi from Iran. So, you know.
Amazing.
So he was quite a character. The dean, Philip Thayer, he was another character. He taught international law. And we had just one course in international law. And Dean Thayer, he was a flinty New Englander, and he'd have lunch every day at the Cosmos Club and have a few martinis there and come back. So he was, you know, he wasn't loaded, but he was feeling good. And of course, Priscilla Mason, she was there. She was the administrative assistant to the dean, and everybody loved Priscilla. And I'm just trying to think of other professors that really stood out. Bill Phillips, he was a professor of international economics. At SAIS then, we had to be prepared, you know, for our oral exams in American foreign policy, European diplomacy, our region, international law, and international economics. And Phillips, he was the tin advisor to the government of Malaya. And he had, I think, had served in the U.S. government at one time. And he taught this course in international economics. And he started out the first class, said, now class, he said, I think we have to have a common understanding of terms. He said, what's your definition of economics? Well, we got a whole variety of economics definitions, some of which were quite convoluted, and he said, you're all wrong. He said, economics is common sense made difficult. And, you know, so that's how we started. And I remember in an exam, I got 102.
Congratulations.
Not 100, but 102.
That's great.
But the other thing I remember about SAIS was the oral exam.
Sure.
And, of course, I prepared long and diligently for that. Every day I went out to the P Street Beach. And I'd sit out in the sun and for hours studying. And it was nice and peaceful and quiet out there, just kind of off P Street there on the Georgetown side of Rock Creek Park. And I studied very hard for several days until 2 days before. I stopped studying. That night I went to a movie, 2 nights before the exam. I don't remember what the movie was, but then the day before the exam, I played 18 holes of golf down at Haynes Point.
Good for you.
And then that night, I went to an Laurel and Hardy movie at the Ontario Theatre up on Columbia Street, up there in, well, anyway. So when I went into the exam, which was in the dean's office, and we had several professors there, we had the dean, we had Phillips, we had Linebarger, we had, oh God, his name escapes me for the moment, Bill Johnstone. He taught courses on Southeast Asia. So all of them examined me. And I think it lasted, I don't know how long it lasted, an hour and a half. Well, I was as loose as a goose. I was just as relaxed as I could be. But Phillips was the one who really put me through my paces. He said, now Dick, he said, you and I are going on a tour of the Far East. And he said, we're going to start out in Japan, and we're going to leave the United States. And he said, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about each of the destinations. So he said, we started out in Japan. How do you get there? And I said, aircraft. What's the currency? I said, the yen. He said, what's the exchange rate? 360 to 1. And then he asked me a few questions about the Bank of Japan. And then he said, next stop is Korea. I said, well, we get there by plane. And the exchange rate is the won, and the currency is the won, and it's 500 to 1. So I did fine with the first two countries. Then we went to Taiwan. Well, I said it was the yuan. And what's the exchange rate? I haven't the foggiest notion. And then we went to the Philippines, and I didn't know the answers there as to the currency and the rate of exchange. We got down in Southeast Asia, none of these, and I just kept saying, I haven't the foggiest. I think we went to Hong Kong. I knew there was a Hong Kong dollar, but I didn't know what the exchange rate was. So anyway, when we finished the exam, and I sat out in the outer room there, and after a while, they came out, and they congratulated me, and they said, you passed.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And Phillips said to me, and I said to Phillips, I said, my God, I said, I thought I'd flunk this darn thing. He said, because of those questions you asked me. He said, I wasn't interested in any of that. He said, I wanted you to know about the role of a central bank and its functions. And he said, you answered my questions about the Bank of Japan perfectly.
That's great. Well, and congratulations. And then you graduated and you started an illustrious career. And tell me a little bit about like the launch of your career and where that went for you.
Well, what I wanted to do was I wanted to go into Army intelligence as a civilian. When I was in the Counterintelligence Corps, I thought very seriously about staying in the Army because being a young single officer in the Army was a pretty nice deal. And I had great assignments in both Japan and Korea. And so I had decided that I wanted to go back into Army intelligence as a civilian. And while I was at SAIS in my second year, I was invited up to Fort Halliburton for an interview for a job with positive intelligence, which was the Army's term for clandestine intelligence. And I was interviewed up there for that, but I also had a physical exam up there. And they discovered something on my lung, which looked very suspicious. And so that disqualified me for that job. And I won't bother to go into it, but I know what it was a disease called sarcoidosis, and it was benign in my case with no symptoms, and it just eventually went away. But so I came back, I was still at SAIS, and I did interviews with various places. I did interview for the CIA. I did take the Foreign Service exam, but I really wasn't interested in the Foreign Service, so I didn't even pursue an oral exam there. And I wasn't interested in the CIA. I was interested in the Army. But when I graduated, there weren't any openings in the Pentagon with the Office of Assistant Chief of Staff and Intelligence, which is where I wanted to go to be an analyst on current intelligence on China and Japan and Korea. There were no openings there, so I took a job with an outfit called the U.S. Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence Agency, and I worked over in Arlington Hall for Arlington Hall Station over on Route 50 in Arlington for 3 years. And I would say to students who are interested in intelligence, if they're interested in being a strategic intelligence researcher or an analyst, that's great. But I decided that I didn't like the tedium of it. And so I wanted to get up on the Hill, Capitol Hill, and because I'm a political animal. And so I started networking like mad, and I got to know various people. But back then in 1960, there weren't many jobs on the Hill. It was a lot. Staffs were a lot smaller than they are now. But at least I made quite a few contacts and whatnot. But I stayed in the Army as a civilian for 3 years exactly, because that would then give me status or tenure or whatever in the civil service. But I quit my job. At this point I was engaged to Luda, and who was graduating from SAIS in 1961, 3 years after I'll let her tell the story about how we met. Well, that's another story, and we did that at a dinner at SAIS some years ago. Anyway, we got married. I had a fellowship to go to Homewood in Baltimore for a PhD in political science. And I decided I want to get in a PhD, and then I thought, well, maybe I'll go into teaching or something like that. Well, while I was up in Homewood during the autumn, I got a phone call from a fellow, I'd completely forgotten him, a fellow by the name of David Abshire. I'd met Dave in 1960. He was the staff director of the House Republican Policy Committee. And Dave said, I'm with the American Enterprise Association, which is now the American Enterprise Institute. And he said, I'd like to talk with you. And so I came down and met with Dave. And he said, would you be interested in a job at AEA? He said it would be working with Congress. He said, we get requests from members of Congress for background research or help on speeches and things like that. And he said, would you be interested? I said, I'd love it. And so, you know, I jumped at it. Because I saw it as a stepping stone to the Hill.
It's those serendipitous moments in life. Yeah.
So I quit Hopkins at the end of my first semester, came down here, started working at AEA at the beginning of February, and I was there for almost 2 years. Meanwhile, Abshire left AEA in the summer because he and Admiral Arleigh Burke had just founded the Center for Strategic Studies at Georgetown University, a new think tank. And I stayed on at AEA. And of course I had met various senators and their staff people. I'd written speeches for a number of senators, mostly Republicans. And that led to a job with Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania as his legislative assistant. And I fell into that job, luckily, because I'd gotten to know his legislative assistant very well, and his legislative assistant took a job in Albany as a lobbyist with Mobil Oil, and he recommended me as his replacement. And so I went to work for Hugh Scott and started what was 5 years of my 5 best working years in my whole career was with Hugh Scott. A marvelous human being. We became the dearest of friends for the rest of his life. He passed away in 1994 at the age of almost 94. And it was truly a great experience because he and I had a complete identity of views. My political hero as a boy growing up was Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York. I originally wanted to be governor of New York, I was going to go into law and then into politics. But by the time I was old enough to vote at age 21, I decided I didn't want to run for office.
You've moved on to other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But and I worked with Hugh Scott for 5 years. We had a very close relationship. I drafted bills for him. I say I drafted it. It was the Office of Legislative Counsel who drafted. I'd tell him what to do. I drafted bills for him, amendments for him. He expected me to tell him how to vote on every roll call vote in the Senate because senators come and go from the chamber, you know, and so when there was a vote, you know, he'd be coming in just before his name was being called, so I had very quickly had to tell him. First I'd tell him how to vote, and then if time permitted, I'd tell him what it was he was voting on.
Okay.
He trusted me completely. And in all those 5 years, he never questioned a single bit of advice I gave him.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's neat.
And
what did you do after working with him then?
well, I loved working for him, but the hours were very long. You know, depending on you know, when the Senate was in session, sometimes I'd be there till after midnight. You know, on a normal day, I'd get home maybe around 7 o'clock or so at night. But so, and our daughter, she was born in 1965. I was with Hugh Scott from January of 64 to January of 69. And, you know, I decided that I really wanted to have more time with my family. So I took a job with Merck, the pharmaceutical company, and for almost 10 years I was their Washington representative and director of government relations. I really did very little lobbying, but you know, it was more intelligence, keeping management apprised of legislation of interest to that would have an impact on the company. Although while I was at Merck, I did have what was a rare opportunity to arrange for the introduction of a bill, and I shepherded its passage through both houses of Congress. It took a year and a half to do, at 2 Congresses. It was a bill to suspend for 3 years the duty on concentrated poppy straw, which is the raw material for morphine and codeine. And Merck and 2 other companies were a legal monopoly for the production of morphine and codeine. And the other 2 companies got their, and concentrated poppy straw, that's a derivative of opium. And the other 2 companies got theirs from France and the Netherlands. Merck got ours from Hungary, which was a communist country and not a most favored nation. So we were at a competitive disadvantage with the other 2 companies. So we had to get, because they got theirs duty free while we had a duty.
Yeah.
So I found a sponsor on the House Ways and Means Committee, and it was his last year in Congress, so we didn't get the bill passed that year. It was too late to get it passed that year, but it took 10 months to get it passed in the next Congress, and I found another sponsor for that. And then it was a matter of just bird-dogging the bill all the way through both houses of Congress, and we got it passed, and it saved Merck
that was an exciting day at the end of that.
Yeah.
That's great. And then after that, where did your career take you?
Well, then I went to the National Food Processors Association as their Vice President of Legislative Affairs, and I was there from 78 to 85. And I lost my job there because they fell into hard times economically. Dues payments were down, membership dues were down. So 3 of us who were vice presidents over the course of time, we were big ticket items, so we were laid off. And that was quite a blow to me. But so I was unemployed for a while, but then I took a job with an outfit called the International Service Agencies, and that was an umbrella group of American charities working overseas, like CARE, Project Hope, Save the Children,
Oh, wow.
Foster Parents Plan, and we participated in employee fundraising campaigns, the main one being the Combined Federal Campaign for all federal employees worldwide. And I was their national coordinator for the Combined Federal Campaign.
And how long were you there?
I was there for almost 5 years. And then I lost that job, but they kept me on as a consultant for a while. And then Dave Abshire, who is president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which at that point was an independent group. They had divorced from Georgetown. They had an amicable separation from Georgetown. And Dave Abshire asked me to come on board at CSIS as his special assistant. And so I did in the fall of 1990. And I was with CSIS. I became Director of External Relations there. And then I became a senior associate, and Zbig Brzezinski, who is a professor at SAIS, although he doesn't teach there now, but he did. And Zbig was a counselor. He's a counselor and trustee at CSIS. Zbig had conceived a project on Ukraine. Ukraine had become independent in 1991 from the Soviet Union, and in early '93, Zbig went to Ukraine and Russia, and came back, and he was alarmed about Ukraine, that he was afraid that their independence was so fragile that we needed to do something to help Ukraine. And he came up with the idea of a high-level group of Americans and Ukrainians, and Americans being public figures in private life, like himself and Henry Kissinger, General John Galvin, who was a retired Army general who had been the NATO commander, and George Soros, and other luminaries. And on the Ukrainian side, it was largely people from their government. This was a group, the American Ukrainian Advisory Committee. Its purpose was twofold. Its biggest purpose was to lobby the United States government, the Clinton administration, to elevate Ukraine's profile within our government, and to have the administration treat Ukraine as an equal to Russia. And so this was an effort to throw a lifeline to the Ukrainians, to let them know that some prominent Americans cared about Ukraine and its future. And so we had a series of meetings, and Zbig asked me to run it. So I was the executive director of it.
Congratulations.
And I worked very closely with Brzezinski, who's another great human being.
Yeah.
I would say that working with him was the second most satisfying experience of my career. You know, I'd still put Hugh Scott right up there, but Zbig was a marvelous human being. He was a joy to work with, and I got to travel with him, because we had meetings in Kiev, we had meetings in Washington, and also in New York, and then we organized a conference in Berlin, because we wanted to elevate Ukraine's profile in Western Europe. And so Zbig came up with the idea of a conference on the new geopolitical shape in Central Europe, and we had a group of prominent Germans, Poles, Ukrainians and Americans meet for a day-long conference in the Berlin City Hall.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And so I continued in that capacity. Then when our project, a project like that doesn't last permanently. You can only go back to the foundation so much for money. So then I just, on a pro bono basis mostly, but I did get some consulting fees, continued to work on Ukraine. I organized a couple of working groups on Ukraine in connection with their parliamentary elections in 2000 and the presidential election in 2004. And Brzezinski and I went to Ukraine, and Luda went with us, to Ukraine in 2004 in connection with the presidential elections. And we met with the President of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, and the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who's now the President.
Fabulous, wow. And
other leading figures hammering home the message that the elections needed to be free and fair in 2004, which initially they were not. Yanukovych was elected by fraud, but then it was reversed, thanks to the Orange Revolution. And then after that, I've been pretty much retired.
That's okay.
I maintain a connection with CSIS, but I don't get down there very much.
But so well deserved. You had such a fantastic career. That's so neat. And thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, given today's students and how SAIS has grown, what advice would you give to current students today based on your career? Is there anything you would change, or anything in hindsight you would be able to pass on that would be helpful?
Well, I guess the most important thing I would say, of course it depends on what they want to do, but no matter what they choose, whether they want to go in the foreign service or in another part of government or the private sector, albeit the nonprofit sector. I mean, the nonprofit sector desperately needs people. Then, of course, there's business. When I was at SAIS, most people went into government, I think. A fair number went into banking. It seemed to me like banking was an area where people went into. But most of us went into government. Pete Geithner, who was a year behind me at SAIS, who was the Secretary of Treasury's father, he went into the Ford Foundation. But that was, I can't think of many people who went into the non-governmental sector at that time, although my memory may be failing me in that regard. But I think the most important thing a SAIS student can do is to start networking and start especially getting to know recent graduates of SAIS who are in jobs, particularly in the Washington area, but elsewhere as well, but particularly in the Washington area. And I assume that SAIS now, their career services, does a lot in arranging for SAIS students to meet others.
And outreach,
get to know people on the Hill and in the executive branch and the World Bank and the IMF. And
you certainly did a lot of that early in your career. Helped you a lot down the road.
Well, it did.
Yeah.
It did. I think back, I'm trying to recall how I got started networking when I was over at Arlington Hall Station. Somebody put me in touch with, somehow or other I met William Baruti, who was then the president of the American Enterprise Association. And Baruti put me in touch with William Sullivan, who was a high official in the FBI. And somehow or other I got to, I think Rudy may have put me in touch with Dave Abshire. I know I got in touch with the administrative assistant to our congressman, who was from my hometown, Jack Hawkins. And Jack put me in touch with 2 or 3 people on the Hill. And you know, so then
absolutely,
that's how you get started.
Yeah. And there are people who out there who want to help too.
And of course, when I was at AEA, then AEI, I got to know a lot of people on the Hill, both staff people and particularly senators, some congressmen too. But because I wrote speeches for several, I wrote a series of speeches on Cuba for various Republican senators, and I always remember there, one of them, Senator Jim Pearson of Kansas, he was a new senator, and Jim, my God, with him, he really worked, because Jim, I went through draft after draft after draft with him, and in the course of it, I said to him one day, I said, Senator, I said, you know what you need? I said, you need a hotshot research assistant. He said, really? I said, who do you have in mind? I said, me. And, well, he was a very deliberate guy, and he said, well, let me think about it, you know. And meanwhile, you know, what emerged from our efforts was pure Jim Pearson. I felt like saying to him, Senator, why didn't you sit down and write the speech yourself? Because it was all Jim Pearson when we got finished with it.
Yeah.
By contrast, I was asked to write a speech for Senator Goldwater in 1962, attacking the Geneva Agreements on Laos, which had been negotiated by Averell Harriman. And, well, I knew something about Laos from my time at SAIS. And I drafted this speech, and I happened to agree with Goldwater on Laos. So I drafted this speech critiquing the agreements. It was a Senate floor speech, and Dave Abshire and I took it up to him. And we met in his office, and Goldwater was a very friendly fella, nice guy, but not very bright, to put it charitably. I think he might have known where Laos was, although that was questionable. He took my speech and delivered it word for word on the Senate floor without so much as changing a punctuation mark. I was absolutely flabbergasted. Well, anyway, I mean, he didn't do it that very day, but when Abshire and I walked out of the office, I said to Abshire, I said, do you think people really take him seriously as a presidential candidate because he was being mentioned as a Republican presidential nominee in '64? I said, this guy isn't qualified to be president. Well, he was our nominee, you know. I voted for Lyndon Johnson that year because
Interesting.
But,
yeah. But your point is really well taken. Just giving advice to current students of really utilizing the services and the networking opportunities.
Yeah, start with the alumni.
Yeah.
Start with the alumni.
Yeah,
and then anybody you meet, whether, you know, it's with an embassy, you know, these embassies now, I guess, well, I know as a fact, a lot of them, some of these embassies hire Americans to work on government relations.
Yeah.
And, you know, government relations is an honorable career to get into.
Sure.
The word lobbyist is bad in some quarters, and some people have done a good job of making it bad. Yeah. But it is an honorable profession. And but whatever area that they want to go into, my biggest advice would be to just as soon as you can start networking.
Yeah. Well, that is great, and I wanted to say thanks so much for sharing your story with us today and for participating in the oral history program.
Yeah.
And it's been lovely for me to get to know you more and hear about your fantastic career. So thanks for all you do for SAIS and for the world, really.
I wish I could get down to SAIS more often. I do get the weekly calendar, and there look like some interesting events, but I'm not I have some difficulty walking, and I keep an eye out though, because if there's something interesting that looks of interest, I like to get down.
Well, we will.
We have
keep
a
you
Murphy
informed.
fellow down there,
Yeah.
and we haven't met her yet. I did communicate with her by email, and I'd like to come down sometime and have lunch with her. And
Absolutely.
you know,
Well, anytime, you know you're welcome.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for staying connected and for all you do. So,
well, thanks
thanks
you.
for being here today.
Well,
Appreciate it.
that was